Hi, this is Bob Wormsley from INSYDIUM, and the new xParticles public release is almost here. This is packed full of new features, 2 of which we have had in the early access version, and now they're going to be in the full public release. That is particle-based dynamics and xParticles shatter. Let's have a look at some of Mario's stunning renders using these tools. As you can see, we can shatter objects apart and have them dynamically behave with particles. Simulate soft bodies, dynamic splines. These splines can be advected with ExplosiaFX. We can do grains with object interaction. You can combine xpShatter and xpDynamics with a whole xParticles toolkit. Let's jump into Cinema 4D and see how it works. So in this scene, we've got our xpShatter working alongside our xpDynamics. We've got the scene object of a platonic, and it is breaking apart into these shards and interacting with the floor. But we can do so much more. Instead of this breaking apart immediately, let's go to the Voronoi layer and change the trigger from always to time, and it's going to happen after 10 frames. So now after 10 frames, it shatters into those pieces. But the true power of shatter is that we can do recursive shattering. We can get these shards to then shatter again on collision. So let's activate this second Voronoi layer, make sure the trigger is set to collision with polygons, and now if we hit play, it shatters first and then it shatters again as it hits the floor. So we're getting this recursive sub-shattering as our simulation runs, and you can have as many different layers of these as you like. And of course, because this is xParticles, shatter and dynamics will work with all of the xParticles dynamic objects. So let's activate this explosion grid, and now we're going to get these sub-shatters creating a smoke and fire explosion as they impact and shatter on the ground. So let's have a look at the basics of how these 2 objects work. So here we have this interactive staircase and floor, which has an xParticles collider tag, but our cube isn't respecting the xParticles gravity, so we need to make it behave dynamically. Let's go to the cube, we'll go to tags, xParticles tags, and pick the xpDynamics. If I go forward 1 frame, you will see if I dolly in that a particle has been born onto each vertex of this cube. So now if we hit play, let's see what happens. And the cube is behaving dynamically, and that is because the particles are respecting the gravity and it is making the geometry follow, so we can have these nice rigid-bodied simulations. The xParticles dynamics don't just work on single objects, they work on generators and sprites too, with only 1 tag. They also work with MoGraph cloners, again, only using 1 tag. Soft bodies are quick and easy to set up. So in this scene, we have our dynamic cube, which is very much a rigid body. So let's get this to look like a soft, squidgy inflatable instead. So to do that, what we'll do is go to our xParticles dynamics tag, and let's first of all reduce the rigidity. I'm going to bring this way down to almost nothing. And let's hit play, and we should have some squashiness. Right, we've developed some squashiness to our rigid-bodied cube now, but we can go 1 step further. We're able to activate some constraints. So I'm just going to switch on structural constraints. Let's go to the display tab and make sure we can see both the particles and those constraints. And we'll go back to the first frame. So now you can see we have these constraints, which are like springs, which are connecting these particles together. And now we have these constraint springs active, you're going to see a much more floppy, realistic looking soft body. So let's have a look. So we're getting it bending around all over the place, and we've got some pretty harsh Phong shading problems there. So the quickest way to sort that out and make this look like a much higher res simulation than it is simply to put it in a subdivision surface. So let's just activate this subdivision surface, and now we'll see that we've got this really, really loose, wobbly soft body rolling its way down this staircase. And of course, if you want this to be more rigid, you can add more rigidity, which means it won't squash as much. and we're getting a very fast simulating, fast solving, but realistic soft body simulation. The xParticles dynamics also work with the fluid solvers as well. This means we can get objects to float and interact with water. So here we've got some scene objects, each with an xParticles dynamics tag. And you can see as we hit play, they will drop down and they'll interact with this FluidFX simulation and be bobbed around as that turbulence is affecting that water. We can increase the density value way up of each object, which means that they'll sink to the bottom of that fluid, or we can reduce that density way down and they'll pop up and come back to the surface. So the xParticles dynamics working with all of the xParticles dynamics solvers for full control. Let's set up some spline dynamics and make a nice interactive rope. So in this scene we have this white spline. If I hit play, nothing will happen because it has no dynamic properties. So if we go to the spline and add a tag, xParticles tags and a dynamics, we need to do a couple of things for spline dynamics. First of all, let's reduce the rigidity of the dynamics to 0. And we also need to go to the constraints menu and add a structure constraint. If I hit play, we have some action. The spline turns into a rope and falls to the floor, but that is all that happens. So what we want to do is pin it in place so it doesn't all fall. So to do that, let's go to point mode and we'll select this top point. Let's go to select, set selection, and we're going to use this as a pin map. So let's just go back to the normal view. And in the spline, let's go to tags, xParticles tags, and add an XP pin. And we're going to use our selection as the pin map. So now what we should get is a dynamic spline, which is moving around with the scene turbulence and gravity. And that's working really well. Let's just disable the view of those dynamic particles. So there we go, there's our dynamic spline. So how might we duplicate this to have interacting splines, ropes, or even tendrils? Well, let's duplicate this by using MoGraph. So we'll go to MoGraph and we'll add a cloner. Let's put the spline as a child of the cloner. And we will deactivate fix clone and let's pick a grid array and we'll just have one in the Y. And that'll probably do us for now. We could perhaps reduce that spacing a little. There we go. So if I now make this cloner editable by hitting C, what we get is lots of individual splines with their own tags and pins. So let's hit play now. And now we have all of these different splines interacting. So let's try and make some geometry from these. So if we take a generator spline mesher, and in the object tab, let's just drag in this parent null, this cloner. And now we have some ropes or tendrils. Let's hit play. And that's looking good. Let's just make the splines invisible. Now, the only problem is that these will be intersecting. We need them to collide with each other so they don't intersect. So the way we do that is very simple. We get a constraints object. Let's activate collisions in our constraints. Now hit play and you'll see that these tendrils, they will wrap around each other, they'll collide with each other, but they will not intersect. Let's just get that turbulence and whack up the strength a bit to make this work a little bit harder, and we'll start seeing these wrap around each other, intermingle, not intersect, and we get this really, really interesting look as these dynamic, almost organic looking tendrils interact in the scene. xpShatter is a tool to shatter apart scene objects. Let's take this cube and make it a child of our xpShatter, and it is immediately broken into these pieces. We can colorize those shards for a look you might be familiar with. We're able to explode those shards out. We can offset them as well, and also we're able to change the seed and it'll automatically update with different shards, and we can of course change the amount of points so we have far more shards in our scene. There are lots of different strategies for shattering your objects to pieces. We can use the inbuilt point generator, which will generate points which we can increase or decrease for more or fewer shards, and we can change that random seed for different looks. Let's just disable that for now. We can also use any scene spline. Let's activate this curvy spline here. And we're getting this fantastic shatter. This is really good for those falling away ground scenes. We'll deactivate that. We can also use any scene object. So here I have a sphere, and it's using the object vertices to define where the shatter is taking place. And let's just deactivate that. And really interestingly, we can use xParticles emitters for this. And you'll see wherever the particles interact with our object is defining where those shard cut points are taking place. And we can, of course, layer up all of these various different shattering types. So if we just go back to frame 1 and reactivate our point generator and then play with our particles, we can see that it is joining and using both sources to make these shatter points. We could bring back in the spline for more interesting animations. And even let's bring in the sphere. Let's go all out and have all of our objects contributing towards this shatter. And the closer that gets, we start to get this kind of grid effect from the vertices of that sphere. So really versatile, multiple ways of shattering your scene objects. Let's turn this scene cube into a pane of glass which we want to smash. So we'll take the cube and make it a child of our shatter object. This has a reflective transparent material. So there we have our window pane, and you can see that we already have this really nice radial shatter pattern. If we go into the shatter object, we can see that the Voronoi point generator has been set to radial mode, which gives us this really nice look. And of course this remains editable throughout, so we can increase the points or reduce the points. We can have more rings within this pattern or fewer rings. We're able to increase the maximum radius or decrease it really far down to get that kind of bullet hole look. This remains fully editable throughout the process. So let's just leave it at that for now. That looks pretty nice. So what we want to do is control these shards now, and this really reveals the true power of shatter, because what we're able to do is assign an emitter to the shatter object. So let's do that. We'll go to shatter, let's drag in this emitter, and now you can see a particle has been born for every shard. And we're able to manipulate these particles, which will then in turn make the shards follow. So let's activate this explode modifier, and we should have these particles blasting away from it. Let's press play, and there they go. So they're blasting away, and it's the particles which are being moved, and they are forcing the shards to follow. There's another feature which is very useful. If we go to the shatter object, we're able to tick auto particle radius, and if we do that, what happens is each particle is resized depending on the size of the shard it is assigned to. So this is particularly useful for data mapping. Now I've told my explode object only to move particles of a certain radius, so the bigger ones will stay still. So let's have a look. And now we've only got those internal particles spitting out. And of course, this remains completely editable right the way throughout the process. The particle-based control system of Shatter makes it incredibly versatile. Instead of using data mapping, in this scene we're going to use this spherical field to allow us to art direct which shards remove and shatter at what point. So there we can see we can shatter off those shards as and when we like. Now you can see that we haven't actually got any spin in these shards, they're just flying off, which doesn't look particularly good. So let's activate this spin modifier, and we can use exactly the same spherical field for this spin modifier, and now we are getting these shards flying off, and we're getting some nice spin as they're floating through the air. So that makes this incredibly versatile. But what we have here is nothing that's actually dynamic. We're just kind of faking the dynamics in this scene. So let's, instead of doing that, let's use real dynamics with the brand new xParticles dynamic system. So let's just deactivate that spin modifier for now, and what what we'll do is we'll go to the, let's go to the shatter object. We'll go to tags, xparticles tags, and let's put on a dynamics tag. So we'll stick that on, and this is going to birth some new particles. So let's set it to distribution, vertices and midpoints. We'll go forward a frame, and now we have got these dynamic particles which have been birthed onto our object. So let's just go to the display and disable the display of those particles because we don't need to see them. So now what we're able to do is still use our spherical field, but the particles are going to behave dynamically as that explode modifier blasts them away, and we're getting some really nice, realistic and proper dynamic spinning and floating around in our scene. So that's very nice, and we can go one step further with this setup. Now that we have our dynamic particles spawned onto our shatter shards, we can spawn debris particles from their position. So let's just activate this spawn modifier, and we'll go again. And now we're getting these really nice debris particles that are being spawned as and when our shards are blasting away from our pane. So incredibly versatile, easy to set up and art direct scenes using shatter with particle control and xpDynamics. Shatter has several settings which allow you to choose exactly when your object is shattered apart. In this scene we've got a sphere which is a child of this shatter, and it has an xparticles dynamics tag attached to it which is helping it fall towards the floor. But it is not breaking into any pieces, and that's because if we look in the shatter settings, the one and only Voronoi layer isn't activated. So if I activate this Voronoi layer and hit play again, you can see that the object is broken apart immediately, and that is because the shatter layer is set to trigger always, so it just happens all the time. But we've got different options. Let's choose, instead of always, time. So now it will shatter after whatever time you define in this box here. So I've got this set at 50 frames, so this will probably hit the floor before it breaks apart. So it hits the floor, and then on 50 frames it shatters. We've also got speed, so it has to reach a specific speed before the shattering takes place. If I set this to say 2000 centimeters per second, the ball's never going to reach that speed, and so it never shatters. Similarly, if we stick it down to say 5 centimeters a second, it'll reach that speed almost immediately and then shatter. Let's put it to say 800 centimeters, and this will be a middle ground. It'll start by not shattering, and then halfway down its path it's going to shatter. That's when it gets the speed and it shatters into all of those pieces. There is another mode which is incredibly useful for visual effects and destruction shots. If we go into the trigger menu and pick collision, we can get this to shatter when the ball collides with an object. So in this instance it's going to collide with the floor, and when it does, it shatters apart. So incredibly useful and versatile triggering options for when your object breaks. We're able to use multiple shatter layers and use different triggering options for each for some pretty amazing recursive shattering techniques. So in this scene we've got this dynamic sphere and we want to break it apart. So let's activate our first Voronoi shatter layer, and this one is set to trigger on time at 20 frames. So we hit play, and after 20 frames it shatters into the pieces that we have set. So that looks very nice. But what we want to do is add some sub-shattering. So let's activate this second Voronoi shatter layer, and this one the trigger is set to collision, and we want these pieces to shatter when they collide with scene geometry. So now if we hit play, they shatter after 20 frames, and now the sub-shards shatter again once they hit the scene geometry, which is great. So let's go one step further. We will add another Voronoi layer, and this one again is set to trigger on collision, but we've set the collision speed really high, so only the very fast moving shards are going to shatter into really, really tiny pieces. And so we've got a massive amount of control here in shattering and then sub-shattering those shards in a dynamic way. Great for those visual effects destructive scenes. So an amazing addition to the xParticles toolkit. Shatter and Dynamics work seamlessly alongside other xParticles modifiers and dynamic objects, fluid simulators, fire and smoke, grains, you name it, they will work. And that is exactly what Mario did to harness those different techniques to create these stunning renders. So make sure you get on board and get your hands on this amazing new public build. See you next time.